I guess I thought what I'd do is maybe talk for about a half hour or so and then take questions or discuss anything you'd like to discuss. So maybe it makes, and feel free to, if I'm talking too fast or using too many acronyms or I'm just not clear, just feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. So maybe it makes sense to, as Lloyd said, talk a little bit about the Vera Institute, just so you get a sense of what we do, and then maybe I'll spend a few minutes on a couple of the issues we deal with a lot, and probably this issue of mass incarceration, how many people we have in prison in the United States, which is an issue we work on a lot. I'll spend a few minutes on that. We can talk about crime in New York City, and then I'll, if I make it through all that, I'll stop. So the Vera Institute's it's an interesting place. We've been around for, I guess, 52 years now, right? We're nonpartisan. We don't identify with any particular ideology. The other thing that's sort of interesting about Vera is that we work with government. That's what we do. We don't do advocacy. We don't do community organizing. We don't sue government. There are plenty of good groups that do that sort of stuff. The Civil Liberties Union, the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Center on Constitutional Rights, the Correctional Association of New York. There are a lot of great organizations that do that sort of advocacy. We don't do advocacy. We work with governments when government is interested in changing something they do, making some reform to their criminal justice system. So we work with governments all over the country. I think we're probably working in about 45 states right now in the country, tons of cities within those states. We do a fair amount of work internationally, primarily in China and Africa. So we do several things when we start a process of working with government to reform their criminal justice systems. We do research, as Lloyd mentioned. We have a lot of researchers at Vera. Vera has about 200 people, I guess, that work for it. About 35 of them are full-time researchers. So we do a lot of research. We have a lot of research capacity. We also run what we call demonstration projects, and one of the unusual things that Vera does is we run sort of on-the-ground service delivery programs, mostly in New York, but not totally in New York. So we'll spot some gap in the criminal justice system, and if we think there's something we can do to make it better, we'll start running a program to see if that works. And so an example of that might be, based on our research, we found, every state has different ways of handling juveniles, juvenile offenders, juvenile delinquents. So in New York State, the way New York State handles them, do people know at what age you're considered an adult in the criminal justice system in New York? What age does New York State consider you to be an adult offender? 18, anyone else? 16. There's only 2 states in the United States where you're an adult at 16. New York is one, and North Carolina is the other. And North Carolina is actually about to change. So New York will be, probably in the next year, the only state that considers you an adult offender when you're 16. I know some of you are not that far from 16, so don't take offense to this, but you are not an adult when you are 16. You're a kid. That's not just because that's what I think. There's a lot of science on this. There's a lot of science on brain development. All the science says, people's brains keep developing until they're in their early 20s. But there's no science, there's no objective scientist who would say when you're a kid at 16, you have a fully developed brain that can make all sorts of responsible decisions. That's why teenagers do a lot of stupid stuff. But anyway, that's the law. And so if you commit a crime when you're 16 and it's a violent crime, you'll be tried as an adult offender in New York State. And if it's a serious crime, you'll go to prison for a long time, sometimes for the rest of your life. It's And there are a lot of people who are working to try to change that, to raise the age of when you're a juvenile in New York. But given the fact that it's 16, the process that New York has, and this is a long way of talking a little bit about what Vera does. So kids who commit crimes are considered juvenile delinquents, or if there's a kid who commits a serious crime, violent crime, you're committed a juvenile offender. Right? That's the difference between a juvenile delinquent and a juvenile offender. If you're a juvenile offender and you commit a crime, and a violent crime, the prosecution can decide to try you as an adult. You may be 13, but they can try, that prosecutor can say, I don't care if you're 13, that was an exceptionally violent crime, we're trying you in adult court, and you can get an adult prison sentence. There are not all that many of those cases, and most kids who get in trouble are trouble with the law under 16 are sort of defined as juvenile delinquents. Right? It's basically stupid kid stuff. A lot of truancy, fighting, stealing from bodegas, smoking pot, drinking beer, causing all sorts of havoc. Right? Kids like that are tried in the family court, and depending on what happens to them, they can either go home on probation or they can go upstate. There's a state agency that runs juvenile facilities. They're basically prisons for juveniles in New York. So if you're 15 and a judge says, you know, this is the third time I see you, you keep getting into fights, you really hurt that kid pretty badly the last time you fought with him, I'm done with you. I'm putting you upstate. And you can go upstate for 12 to 18 months to a juvenile facility, which is, again, basically like a prison for juveniles. So in New York, well, up until recently, we send a lot of kids to these upstate facilities. And they're, you know, kids from exactly where you'd think they'd be, right? They're from the sort of poorest areas in the city. They're mostly kids of color. And they're from the 6 or 7 poorest neighborhoods in New York. So it's not surprising about where they're from. So they send them up there. So what do people think it costs in New York State for a kid? You pay for this, your families pay for this, your tax dollars, for a kid to go upstate to a juvenile prison for 1 year. What does that cost? Take a shot. Anyone? Go ahead. I'm sorry, what? 30,000? $260,000. Cost $260,000 a year to send a kid upstate for a year in New York. There's a lot of reasons for that. I can talk about some of them later, but it's unbelievably expensive. Prison, for example, prison in New York State. Lloyd referenced a report we did on prisons because we're interested in how much prisons cost generally, because people tend to know they're expensive, but they don't quite understand how expensive they are. So prison, just as a comparison, the New York State spends the most money on prison per prisoner of any state, and New York State, $60,000. So that's really expensive. It's a hell of a lot less than $250,000. So for that $250,000, right, it's a lot of money. So what would you at least want to see? If you're going to spend $250,000 to send a kid to a juvenile facility, you know, these are kids that have gotten into all sorts of trouble. If you're going to spend $250,000, what would you like to have happen at least? You're paying for this, right? You're the customer. What would you like to see happen for $250,000? Right. Education. Yeah. So you'd like the kid to come back at least a hell of a lot better than he was when he got up. Maybe get a better education, do some anger management. If he had an alcohol or drug problem, get off. If he needed mental health counseling, get off. You'd like to see, at a minimum, you'd like to see that kid not get arrested again. Right? That's a big investment that the taxpayers are making. And, you know, for these kids, it's pretty, you know, they may get into trouble. At the end of the day, they're just kids from the neighborhood. They're going upstate to some place they've never been before, they've never seen before. It's, you know, in the middle of the woods. It's not not a particularly pleasant experience, but you're right, you'd like to see, for that kind of investment, as people say all the time, you could send a kid to Harvard for that amount of money for 4 years. But so kid's probably not going to come back with a Harvard degree, but you'd like to at least say, okay, you know, you're done, get straight and narrow. So what do you think after that investment, what do you think the rearrest rate is, the recidivism rate as we call it? Right? So you've spent the money, the kid's gone upstate for 12 to 18 months. There's been a lot of research done on this, right? How often does that kid, after that investment, over the next couple of years, what percentage of them, forget what you would like to see, you'd like to see none of them get rearrested. What percent of them do you think get rearrested? 86. Pretty close, right? It's in the mid-80s, 90 maybe, 90%. So, and by age 28, right, so those kids are up there when they're 14, 15, 16. They'll come back, 80%, probably closer to 90% get rearrested. 70% of the, because this is for boys and girls, but way more boys go up there than girls. 70% of the boys that go up there, 7 to 10 years later, are in state prison, right? So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize we're paying $250,000 and, you know, 70% of them go back to state prison, 90% of them be arrested. That's not working, right? There's no one who would say, now there's a good use of your tax dollars, right? So that's the kind of thing that Vera does a lot of work on, right? So it's easy enough to find, to realize what I just told you, how much it costs, what the recidivism rates are. And so Vera, that's the kind of issue that Vera starts to get involved in. So why are those kids going upstate? What are they doing? Why would you send them upstate? And I should add now, on top of everything else, the Department of Justice has just taken control over several of those upstate juvenile facilities because they happen to be particularly brutal places where the staff has been shown to, on some regular basis, beat the crap out of these kids. So they're not well run. They can be pretty dangerous places. They're expensive. Right? There's not much good you can say about them. But still, for Vera, it's not enough for us to say, well, that doesn't work. That's kind of stupid. I mean, yeah, it's true. It doesn't work. It's kind of stupid. But we're more in the business of saying, so what should you do? Yeah, that doesn't work. We all can agree that doesn't work. But what is it you should do? You have to do something, right? So the first thing you tend to look at is, so these kids. Who are these kids? Who are these kids who are getting sent upstate by family court judges? You would imagine, if a judge is going to make a decision to send a kid upstate, and that's a big decision. It's expensive. You're locking up a little kid. I mean, they've done some tough stuff, but they're still, they're still kids. So you would imagine a judge is going to do that if he thinks, this kid is it's a huge public safety issue. Like, I have to send this kid away because he's going to hurt someone, and I can't see anything else to do other than incarcerate him, right? That's what you would imagine, because why else would you send a kid up there, right? So that's the kind of thing Vera looks at. So who are the kids? What have they done? And most places in the United States define crimes as felonies and misdemeanors, right? Misdemeanors are the less serious crimes. Felonies are the more serious crimes, and violent felonies are the most serious felonies: murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, etc. So you would assume the kids that are getting sent up there have done at least, like, they're violent felony offenders. Again, why else would you do that? So again, we look at who's going up there, and are most of them violent felony offenders? No. Are most of them felony offenders? No. They're almost all misdemeanor offenders, right? And when you look at what they did, no one, not even the most conservative folks, would say, we're scared of that kid, right? I mean, he's a pain in the ass. He, keeps taking stuff from bodegas. He keeps cutting school. He's smoking joints and drinking beer, right? But no one thinks that kid is going to kill someone, right? He's not going to kill someone. He's just not going to school. He's leading these disorganized lives. But yet, that's who's going upstate, right? That's who you're paying $250,000 for, and that's who eventually winds up back in prison. So again, Vera, this is a long sort of detour into what Vera does, but maybe it's just worth sticking on this for a while because you get a sense of what we do. So then we talk to judges. We say, so why are you sending that kid upstate? And you'll say, like, that kid's not going to kill someone. He's not a threat to public safety, maybe a threat to himself. He's not going to school. He's acting out in all sorts of ways, but he's not a danger to society. And judges will agree. They'll say, yeah, that's right, but here's the thing, right? I have two things I can do to these kids. I can do nothing, or I can just put him on probation and send him back to his house, or I can send him upstate. Like, that's all I got, right? And so that kid, the kid who's constantly getting high, who's missing school, maybe stealing stuff from stores, does he necessarily have to be incarcerated? No. But I can't live with myself just sending him back, right? I don't like his home situation. His parents are absent. His father's not around. There's no one to make sure he's going to school. Like, I can't live with myself if I send him there. So I'm sending him upstate. So we'll say, yeah, but when you send him upstate, this is what happens to him when he comes back. And, judges will say, I get it, but, I'm not sending him home. So I'm sending him there. And so judges will say to us, so give me something else. Give me another option. If there's another option, I won't send kids upstate, right? I could imagine keeping a kid at home if he had wraparound services, if there was someone on his ass all the time, if there was someone working with his family and him to sort of do sort of family-based therapy, if he got mental health counseling, like, I might do that, but I don't have that. So if I got nothing or that, I'm going to that. And that's why kids go upstate, right? That's why, right? That's how these systems work. So what Vera does is say, okay, so what would you need to see? What kind of option would you need? What do you need? And judges will tell us what I basically just said. That's what I need. I need therapy. I need supervision. I need someone to make sure that kid goes to school. I need to work on his literacy, right? I need all this stuff, but that's not cheap. It's not easy, but it ain't $250,000 a year, right? Maybe it's $15,000 a year, right? That's not free, but it's not $250,000 a year. So that's what we do. So then we say, okay, so we'll do that, right? We'll go to government and say, you know what, you should give us a lot of money. And the reason you should give us a lot of money is that we'll build this option that judges want. They don't have it, but we'll give it to them, right? We'll create a whole organization that does nothing but that watches these kids in the community, that provides therapy to them and their families, make sure they go to school, that'll give them drug treatment if they need drug treatment, that'll deal with their mental health issues, which are substantial. We'll do all that. And if we do it correctly, you, the city and the state, you're going to save unbelievable amounts of money. Because we'll keep kids from going up there. Instead of paying $250,000, you could pay $15,000. And we'll say, we can't do any worse than that. How can you do worse than 70% of kids winding up in state prison, 90% of them being rearrested? Like, if we did nothing, it would be better than that, right? So, we're pretty, and we know what we're doing, right? So we know we'll do better than that. And so that's what we do, right? So there's a big agency in the city now called Esperanza. It's a big not-for-profit entity that handles kids exactly like this. The number of kids being sent upstate to New York has shrunk dramatically, not just because of Esperanza, but that led to a lot of other organizations doing the same thing. So that's what Vera does. That's how we work, right? We sort of focus on problems. A lot of organizations just sort of stop at the here's why it's a problem, here's why everything is horrible stage. It's a valuable thing to do. But for us, we always like to ask, so what do you do about it? It may be horrible, it may be awful, but that's not particularly helpful, right? You have to do something other than kind of complain and whine about it. What do you do? And so we try to answer that question, what do you do? And so we create these organizations that I just explain one of them to you, called Esperanza, but there are a lot of organizations that Vera has created, alternative to incarceration agencies, the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, the Center for Employment Opportunities, right? That's just how we do our work. We find a problem, we come up with a solution, we'll test whether our solution works. Doesn't always work, and then we'll shut a program down, but if it does work, we sort of take that thing and make it its own organization, and they sort of grow on their own. So we do research, we do what we call planning and running demonstration projects, which I just explained to you, and then we'll do what we call sort of technical assistance and consulting. We'll take all that stuff we do, research, planning, demonstration projects, and we'll work with other governments who come to us and say, you know, look, we got a problem, right? So one of the frequent examples of that across the country now is states, as you know, have no money, right? The states are in really pretty bad fiscal shape. It's probably going to get worse before it goes better. And so one of the things states tend to do when they have no money is that they cut all sorts of services. And one of the things that they're increasingly looking to reduce is their prison systems, their systems of incarceration. And they're looking at that because we incarcerate in the United States a huge amount of people. In fact, no other country on the planet incarcerates the percentage of people that we incarcerate, right? So there's a lot of statistics that demonstrate this, probably in some ways. There's a couple that really kind of bring it home. We have 5% of the world's population. 5% of the world's population lives in the United States. But we have 25% of the world's prisoners, right? We just lock up a ton of people, right? No one locks up as high a percentage of people that we do, and it has kept growing over time. So in 1965, there were probably about 200 or 250,000 people in jail and prison in the United States. 250,000 30 years ago. Anyone know what that figure is now, give or take? 2.4 million, right? We just keep locking up more and more and more people. So we've become a very tough on crime place, right? Longer sentences, mandatory sentences, 3-strike sentences, right? Politicians historically in the United States, not always, but for the last 30 years, crime has become a very political issue. How do politicians respond to crime? They get tough on crime, right? No one likes crime. No one likes violent crime. Everyone here, I'm sure, you've either been a victim of crime, you know someone who's been a victim of crime, right? It's an issue that everyone is understandably concerned about. People get very angry about it, and politicians have reacted to that anger by increasing sentences more and more and more. So something you used to get 5 years in prison for 20 years ago, you get 20 years in prison today. Something you got 3 months in prison 20 years ago, you get 10 years in prison today. And so what's happened over time is that we just keep putting more and more and more people in prison, right? But we don't just put anyone in prison, right? Most people in prison, almost everyone is poor, right? I mean, not everyone. Martha Stewart went to prison. She ain't poor, right? But, you know, there's not a lot of Martha Stewarts in prison, right? Most people in prison are poor, and people in prison in this country are hugely disproportionately people of color, right? So when people talk about incarceration, they usually talk about rates, right? What percentage of a population do we put in prison? And you know, I know some of you are doing research methods. Statisticians tend to talk about rates in per 100,000. Per 100,000 of this population, how many people go to prison? So for white people in the United States, that number is about the rate per 100,000 is about 200 per 100,000. 200 per 100,000 whites are in prison. Now, it's hard to get a handle on that figure. It doesn't sound like all that much, 100,000, 200 per 100,000. But remember, that 100,000 has babies in it. 100,000 is everyone, right? But just stick with the rate, for example. So 200 whites for every 100,000 whites in this country are in prison. Anyone want to take a guess at what the figure for blacks is? It's 200 per 100,000 for whites. What is it for blacks? What? It's closer to 2,000, right? So proportionally, right, there's not as many blacks as whites in the United States, but proportionally we lock up about 8 or 9 times as many blacks as white, and sort of Latinos, Hispanics are kind of in the middle, right? So it's not that we just lock up a lot of people, we lock up disproportionately people of color. Plus, it's incredibly expensive. No other country on earth, none, not Russia, not China, not South Africa, no one locks up the number of people we lock up, because we've just had a history of getting tougher and tougher on crime, not smarter and smarter on crime, but tougher and tougher on crime. Because politicians get popular when they say, that's it, we're done with people who do this, who rob 7-Elevens. It used to be you get 5 years for robbing a 7-Eleven, now you'll get 8 years for robbing a 7-Eleven. That's 3 additional years, each one of those years is $60,000, that adds up. Plus, the problem with all of that, I won't talk about this for a lot, and I'll only talk for a couple more, but the problem about what politicians do, on the one hand, people think, well, good, that'll teach them. Who wants to go to prison for 8 years? You're adding 3 more years to that. That has to have some, what criminologists call general deterrence, right? That means you're sending a message. We used to send you to prison for 5, now we're going to send you to 8 for holding up, doing an armed robbery in a convenience store. People can sort of relate to that. So here's the problem, right? First of all, no one knows what the penalties are. You think some kid who's going into a 7-Eleven, who's probably whacked out on methamphetamines anyhow, you think that kid knows if he's caught, he's getting 8 versus 5? Most legislators don't even know what the penalties are. How the hell does some kid know, right, that if I get caught, I'm going to go to prison for 8 years? They don't know. No one knows, right? It just sounds good when you pass a new law, right? But the way crime works, real crime, right, is that, deterrence is based on the theory that people make rational, informed decisions. That before you go in and hold up that 7-Eleven, you're going to be sitting on your kitchen table and thinking, okay, I'm going to hold up a 7-Eleven. If I get caught, I could do, I don't know, let me do some research. And then someone will do some research and say, okay, now I understand, now I could get 8 years. That's 3 more years than I would have got 3 years ago. Wait, let me think. Who does that? No one does that, right? No one thinks they're going to get caught. If there was a lot of thinking going on, it wouldn't happen in the first place, right? So you could make the crime, you could say you're going to prison for the rest of your life, right? These guys don't think they're going to get caught, right? They're making an assumption they're not going to get caught. That doesn't mean everyone wouldn't do that, right? I mean, you can imagine if you're going to cheat on your taxes, you might think, oh shit, what could happen to me, right? But most people who do violent crime, who steal someone's pocketbook, who does a strong arm robbery or holds up a liquor store, right? They're just not. No one's weighing the, well, if I get this, I won't do it. But if I get this, yeah, maybe I'll do it. It just doesn't work like that. So you can say you're going to get 2, now you're going to get 4. We're tired of this. We're giving you 8. No one reacts to that. It just means you have, for the people that eventually get caught, now they go to prison for twice as long. Plus, I used to run a big jail system. People have lost all sense of what it even means to be in prison. 1 year, 3 months is a lot of punishment in prison, right? I don't know how many of you have even been in or visited a prison. You don't ever want to go to prison, right? And there's part of the stuff in a lot of cities, kids go in and out of jail, You know, when they're coming out, there's all this myths, no big deal. I can do that time standing on my head. You know, you can say that stuff, but no one actually believes that stuff. No one wants to go to jail or prison. 2 years in prison, that's an unbelievable punishment, right? You go crazy if you have to stay in your apartment for a long rainy weekend for 3 days. Oh, shit, I got to get out of here. You think that's bad? Right? Be in prison for a year, right? You're scared all the time. You eat when someone tells you to eat. You get toilet paper when someone gives you toilet paper. You do whatever someone else wants you to do. You're basically a slave. You're a captive, right? It is a lot of punishment. So just throwing around, 4 years, now it's 8 years. Because 4 years wasn't enough, right? No other country does that, right? When you go to Europe, other developed countries, the things we give 10 years for, they give a year for, right? And they look at us and think, what are you, crazy? Like, have any of you been in prison for a year? You know what a year in prison is? That's a lot of punishment. And, you know, at some level, it's a philosophical debate. How much punishment is enough punishment? You know, what's the right amount of punishment? It's a good debate to have. No one has an answer to it. But what we do, because we do what we do, it takes money from all other areas of government, right? Why do state education systems operate so badly? Because you're paying for prison, that's why. You can't do everything, right? You just can't do everything. So you want to have a big prison system? You're going to pay for it, right? When politicians say, you know, we're going to increase that time from 4 years to 8 years, no one then says, oh, by the way we're going to pay for that is we're going to overcrowd your kids' classrooms so they learn in groups of 60 and we'll have to renovate some bathrooms in your local school because that's where we're going to be putting them. No one says that, but that's what happens, right? So it's a very complicated phenomenon in the United States, and I'll stop after this. But one of the reasons we do a lot of work in this area is because after 40 years of doing this, right, states pay an unbelievable amount for their prison system. And they're all basically saying now that they have no money, you know, we just can't do this. We can't do it anymore. We can't keep building prisons, more and more prisons, when we're throwing little kids off health care, when we're laying off teachers, when we're laying off firefighters and cops. We just can't afford to build these prisons. We got to do something. And that's when they'll come to Vera, right? Because it's not easy to sort of turn that ship around. Yeah.
I wonder if I can insert a question here.
Sure.
Given the massive incarceration rates here compared to other places around the world, how do our recidivism rates compare? Are ours higher or lower?
Ours are high. So our recidivism rates nationally, so for prison, it's kind of the same argument I was making before on the juvenile side. The numbers are a little different. So in the United States, about, give or take, about 700,000 people a year leave prisons all over the United States. At what rate, how many of those people do you think are back in prison within 3 years? So there's 700,000 people leaving prison this year, give or take, in the United States. How many do you think will be back in prison in 3 years? That's not quite that bad. Half, right? 50% of everyone who's been in prison, they're going back to prison. That's not, not particularly surprising. That's very high. It's not particularly surprising. We don't do much for people when they're in prison. I mean, prison costs a lot of money because you need officers 24 hours a day, heat, light, electricity, you're feeding them, you're doing their medical care. It's just expensive. But it's not like we're really dealing with the issues they came into prison for in the first place. So most people get out of prison worse than when they came in, right? And for anyone who has ever experienced prison, that's not particularly surprising, right? They're scary, kind of brutal, humiliating places, right? It's possible for you to get better, but only if a state made a concerted effort to try to do something to make you better. In the absence of that, you're probably going to get worse when you come out, yeah.
Does that have to do with the fact that once you come out of prison, you don't really get any help from the government? So you kind of are going to go back out there and still to, provide for yourself? Because I know, like, if you've gone to jail and you lived with your mom who was in Section 8, you can't stay there anymore.
Correct.
So
right.
Is it more so that there aren't enough policies when people are outside of jail?
Yeah. So there's all sorts, that's a very good point. So first, there's the in-prison piece, and I know I'm running out of time, so I don't want to keep talking. So the first is the in-prison piece, right? You've done something wrong, hopefully, you're convicted, time for you to pay your debt to society, you go to prison. Now, in Europe, for instance, what they do when you're in prison is it's not a chance to just punish you. You're in prison, you're punished, right? That's, you know, there's all, and there's a little side thing, there's always all this debate about, well, he's in prison, but he has cable TV, it ain't that bad. Believe me, the fact that you could watch, you know, Oprah when you're in a prison, that doesn't make it any better, right? No, you know, it's not like people think, oh, cable, this is great. It ain't great. It sucks. It sucks, and you got cable. Anyhow, so we don't do much with you when you're in prison. We kind of house you. We're, you know, hopefully we keep you safe, but we don't deal with your issues, right? In Europe, for example, they make a big point of, okay, you know, what's your reading level? 5th grade. You know, you on drugs? Yeah. You know, you have all sorts of mental health problems? Yeah. So there's a recognition that, okay, we got to deal with that. Because if you don't deal with that, and when they get out of prison, of course they're going to come back to prison. Why wouldn't they come back to prison? So here we do very little of that, and then when you get, so then you get out, 97% of everyone who's in prison gets out of prison, right? They all come back, as people say. They all come back to the same neighborhoods they came from. And so ideally, again, you're paying a lot of money to keep people in prison. At least when they come back, especially since they're coming back to your neighborhoods, you don't want them, you know, hitting a little old lady on the head again, right? You've paid a lot of money. It's been a big deal. You've separated them from their families. You want them to get better, not worse. So they come out of prison. Usually they're worse. And at a minimum, they're worse. Even if they don't get mentally or psychologically worse, now they got a felony conviction, right? That's a big deal to have a felony conviction, right? There's all sorts of what criminologists call collateral consequences. You can't live in public housing. Done. Right? You can't get all sorts of jobs. You can't get licenses. Right? So what a lot of criminologists say is, when does the punishment end? You've been in prison. That's a lot of punishment. Like, and now when you come out of prison, you can't live in public housing. You can't become a barber. People always use that one. That's an incredibly stupid one. Right? In New York State, not all states have this. In New York State, because there's a lot of work programs in prison, and New York State happens to have people that train as barbers when they're in prison, right? People need haircuts. The inmates give haircuts. Some of them become actually really good, really talented. But you can't get a barber's license when you leave prison, right? Why? It's ridiculous. Because you have a scissors? Are you kidding me? You know, I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyhow, so there's all sorts of collateral consequences. You've been in prison, you've been punished, you probably are worse, but even if you're not worse, how do you get a job? It's hard for a young person to get a job if you're not in prison, right? You've been to prison, you have a felony conviction, right? Your options are incredibly limited. So is it a surprise that half of them come back? Of course it's not a surprise. You know, we've made a big initial investment to keep someone in prison. This is why a lot of conservatives now are prison reformers, right? You wouldn't think they'd be, because they're conservative, they're tough on crime, they don't care about this stuff. But they look at this and think, well, we spend all this money, United States at $70 billion. You spend all this money on prisons, and then 50% of people come back to prison. Like, who would tolerate that if that was a business? Who would say, yeah, that's working pretty well. Let's keep doing that. That doesn't work. It's ridiculous. You don't have to be some wimpy liberal to think that doesn't work. Right? So for conservatives, it offends their fiscal sensibilities. Like, we're spending $70 billion and we get that kind of a failure rate? That's ridiculous. Let's do something else. Right? There must be some other thing we can do. You know, punish people a little less in prison, take that savings and do something when they come out. Right? Do something about their education. You've got to do something. I mean, who would tolerate this? And so that's been true for years and years. But now that states have less and less money, they are very focused on this. So to your question, we have some of the highest recidivism rates in the world. I mean, every place has sort of high recidivism rates. It's tough to turn these folks around. You know, it's not unusual for other countries where we have a 50% recidivism over 3 years to have a 25% recidivism rate over 3 years. That's still high. You know, it's still a quarter of people. There's nothing great about that. It just happens to be a hell of a lot better than 50%, right? So So I'll stop with this. So one of the kinds of work we do, where a state will come to us and say, look, we got ourselves into this situation. Maybe we shouldn't have done it, but here we are. Here we are with our prison population like this. We're cutting the crap out of our schools. Parents are going berserk. We have to turn this thing around. How do we do it? What do we do? How do we decrease our recidivism rates? How do we increase people's education when they're in prison? All this stuff, right? And that's what Vera does. Once government gets to a point, either because they've been forced to, or they want to, or they have a realization that they need to do something different, they'll come to us and say, okay, look, you have to help us sort of work through these issues and get us, how can we improve our recidivism rate? How can we save money in prisons and protect public safety at the same time? So that's the kind of work we do. And, again, we'll do sort of research or plan things and test them. That's what makes Vera kind of an unusual place, because no one, probably the largest criminal justice research and policy organization in the country, and that's at least some of the work we do. Sure. When I talk about research, right, we have people who are sort of trained in research methods or statistics or ethnographic or field work study, and the researchers at Vera will work on a variety of issues, right? Anything from, again, going back to a state saying, look, we've been running this big reentry program for 3 years. We have no idea whether it works. We just run it, right? Because people kind of like it, but we don't know if it works. We don't know if it reduces people's recidivism. We don't know if the money we spend is worth the results we get. And so we'll do that sort of stuff. We'll evaluate those programs. Who goes to them? How do they get there? What happens to them when they're in them? Do they have less recidivism? Do they have the same recidivism as if they didn't go to a program? Because then we'll say, well, that doesn't work. You may like it, but that program has the same recidivism rate as prison, so you need to do something else, right? So we'll evaluate programs. We'll see whether programs work or not, right? A big piece of research we're doing now in New York is on stop and frisk. Not the policy. How many people here have been stopped, questioned, and maybe frisked? Yeah, it's more than that, but okay. Right, stop and frisk is a big thing in New York now, right? It's a big debate. NYPD is very aggressive about stopping, questioning, and perhaps frisking people on the street. Mostly they're pretty young. They're predominantly people of color, not surprisingly, because they tend to do it in the high crime neighborhoods that are disproportionately people of color. But these days they make about 700,000 of those stops each year. That's a lot of stop, question, and frisks, right? And it's generated, on the one hand, you have the police saying, well, that's why crime is down in New York, right? Because we stop everybody. The streets are hot. You got to be out of your mind to carry a gun or contraband, because we're going to stop you, especially if you're like a black guy in Brownsville. So we're going to stop you, right? And so the police will say, well, that's why crime is down. That's a small price to pay for reducing crime, right? Because the police are convinced that strategy, the very aggressive strategy, no one stops, questions, and frisks as many people per year as the NYPD. That's how they roll, right? And they roll that way because they believe, and they're a very sophisticated bunch, they believe it is, New York has had this incredible crime decline. It's had twice the crime decline of any other city in America, and for a whole bunch of complicated reasons. And the cops will say one of those reasons is stop, question, and frisk. And there's a big debate on this. It goes on forever. Some people think it's incredibly effective, that's right, that it helps reduce crime. Other people, because there are very few arrests that result from those stops. So a lot of people will say, well, obviously it doesn't work. Most of the people you're stopping don't get arrested, or they don't have any contraband anyhow. So obviously you're not targeting the right people. It doesn't work. You're targeting black and brown kids, and you're just harassing them, you're violating their constitutional rights, it's a racist, ineffective policy. And then you have these other folks who say, no, it works, that's why crime is down. But one of the things we're studying, so we'd love to study that, we'd love to study how effective the policy itself is. It's very complicated to do that, which I can explain. But one of the things we're interested in is what impact do those stops have on the kids who are stopped year after year after year, right? There are kids who are stopped 10, 20 times a year for multiple years, right? What does that mean? What are what we call the costs? We're not talking about financial costs. What does it mean for kids in certain neighborhoods and their families to get stopped again and again and again by the NYPD? Does it have no effect? Do people say, ah, whatever, it's part of life, I don't care? Does it make them incredibly cynical and hate government and say, I hate the NYPD, I'll never report a crime to the NYPD, I'll never do anything to cooperate, because all they do is hassle me, right? I mean, we're curious about what does it mean in those neighborhoods for kids who are stopped all the time? What do their parents think about it? So our researchers will go out for months, right, and interview kids on the street. Right? We'll go to neighborhoods where we know stop and frisk happen a lot, and we'll just talk to kids on the street and their families. Right? Have you been stopped and frisked? Under what circumstances? What happened? What's good about it? What's bad about it? Right? We try to be very objective about that. It's a very hard piece of research to do. What does it mean for, I keep saying kids, I mean it's 16 to 25-year-olds, for young people, teenagers, young men and women. What does it mean for those kids, for their families, for those neighborhoods to have that kind of huge volume of contacts with the NYPD on the street? And we don't go into it thinking, we don't know what people will tell us. Right? Research is always more complicated than you think. We know it's never going to be, it's all horrible or it's all great. Right? It's always going to be some more nuanced piece of research. And we're in the middle of that research now. So we have teams of researchers out in neighborhoods all over the city. They're asking kids to take surveys in local community groups. We ask them about 100 questions. We combine that with going to some of their houses and talking to their families as well. How does stop and frisk affect you? Are you worried about your kids' safety? How do you talk to your kids about stop and frisk? Are you mad at government? Are you mad at police? What do you think about the cops? Right? It's very complicated. But that's research, right? So we can do what we call quantitative research, right? Very sophisticated number crunching, taking big data sets and plowing through them. But we also do what the field calls ethnographic research, right? Getting out to the field, getting out to the neighborhood, and talking to people. In this case, people who are stopped, but we could do another piece of research that involved other types of folks. Our researchers are both skilled at, right? They've gone to undergraduate and many of them graduate programs for how to do research methods, how to do statistics, how to interview people, how to what to make of different kinds of findings. That's the sort of research we do. It's social science research. It's not CSI research. It's not people in white coats looking at a little piece of dust and tracking down the bad guy, right? That's not what we do, right? We try to think, how do programs work or not work? What's effective or not effective? What do people in the street think of, in this case, policing practices? Because that stuff matters. So that's what we do. I guess we'll see what they feel about it, right? When so stop and frisk. So again, if you talk to police, right, they'll say you can't stop and frisk anyone, right? There has to be, people know the phrase, the cops just can't come up to anyone and say, I'm stopping and frisking you. They have to have what? Reasonable suspicion, right? They have to have reasonable suspicion, which is a constitutional requirement that there's some reason that they need to talk to you. What is reasonable suspicion? It's not, you can't just write it on a piece of paper and say here, it is, right? It can't be nothing, right? It can be anything from, you know, someone coming up to a cop and saying, I was just mugged, she mugged me, that's her right there, right? That's reasonable. Based on that, a cop can stop you or me or anyone and then stop, you know, question and potentially frisk. But most frisks aren't that, but that can be a frisk. It can be a cop thinks he sees a bulge in a guy's pants in the back with some metal sticking out. That looks like it could be a gun, right? That's reasonable suspicion. You know, it could be what the police call, you know, furtive movements. You know, what is that? I mean, what's a furtive movement? You know, well, if you ask the cops, a furtive movement will be to some kid on the street corner. He's looking around. He's looking all over the place, right? So a cop will say, that guy's a drug dealer, right? He's looking around for cops. Then maybe he's not looking around. Maybe he has a tick in his neck. Maybe he's looking for his kid. Who knows what he's looking for? But a cop will say, you know, I know. You know, I've been in the street a long time. That guy's a lookout. I'm stopping him. So is that reasonable suspicion, that furtive movement? That's when you start to get, I don't know, maybe. So some are really obvious, like, holy smokes, there's a gun handle sticking out of that guy's pants. That's obvious. Or, you know, saying, you know, getting a report that a woman's just been mugged by a black guy, 6'5", red sweatshirt with a white bandana. And all of a sudden, the black guy with a red sweatshirt, is 6'5", with a white bandana, boom. That's reasonable suspicion. Does that allow you to stop every black guy who passes because there was just a report that a black guy did something? No, that's not reasonable suspicion, right? So you get people, especially in these communities, saying, you're not just stopping us for reasonable suspicion, you're stopping every black kid, you know, who's walking around. And then not only are you doing that, right, but how do you find that contraband in the first place? Now, when I say contraband, I'm mostly talking about weapons. But the cops this is probably going to change, and many of you may know this. The cops make, these days, it's probably going to change, but for the last couple of years, they've made about 50 to 60,000 marijuana possession arrests a year, right? Marijuana possession, right? Not dealing, marijuana possession. You know, so used to be, you know, when I was growing up, a lot of people smoked pot. You could walk down the East Village smoking a joint. If you only take one thing away from this class, don't do that. Because you will get locked up now, right? I mean, that's what the cops do. They make a lot of marijuana arrests. So there's a couple of ways to make marijuana arrests. One is, you see a kid walking around smoking a joint, you're going to get arrested. Right? You may ask, what's the point of arresting a guy smoking a joint? Why? That's a good question, but it's a separate issue because you will get arrested. So one of the things that happens is during those stop and frisks, right? You are allowed. It is not a crime to carry a joint in your pocket. You're allowed to do that, but it can't be in public view. If you take the joint out of your pocket, put it behind your ear, or you're just smoking it, now you're going to get arrested. But if it's in your pocket, it's not a crime, right? So what happens a lot of times, and different people have different interpretations of this. During a stop and frisk, a cop will say, what's in your pocket? Nothing. Empty your pockets. Now, you don't have to empty your pockets. You could say, no, I'm not emptying my pockets. Right? A cop will say, empty your pockets. No big problem. If you don't have anything, you know, if you don't have a gun, what's the big deal? Just empty your pockets. I'm not going to do anything to you. All right. You know. Is that a joint? You're under arrest. Right? And so that's what will happen. Now, a lot of people think beyond that, cops will just go into your pocket. Even, you know, they won't even trick you. They'll just go into your pocket. Both of them are illegal. You can't, well, that's not true. Going into your pocket's illegal. A cop is allowed to say, look, do me a favor, empty your pockets. And most, you know, it's a scary thing, right? You're a kid, it's a big cop, he's got a gun, he's got a partner over there, their hands on your gun, empty it. Okay, I'll empty my pockets. Boom, you got a joint, you're done. So even that, I mean, they find marijuana sometimes, but not a ton, right? So when you look at 700,000 stops, I'm trying to remember the figures, there's only trying to remember, maybe 1% of them result in an arrest, and another 1%, they find something, some kind of weapon, a knife, usually a knife, sometimes a gun. So people use those statistics in 2 different ways, depending on what side of this issue you're on. If you're an anti-stop and frisk person, you say, see, that's what, you stop 700,000 people, all in these 5 neighborhoods, all young, most women too, but mostly men of color. And, you know, at the end of the day, you know, you arrest almost nobody, and you find next to nothing. That's why, that's proof that it doesn't work, that it's ineffective, that it's racist, that you're just doing it to harass people. And there are people who will say, with those exact same statistics, why statistics don't sort of settle an argument all the time. No, that's exactly why it works. Because people are scared to carry guns and knives. People are scared to carry because we're stopping everybody. So you got to be out of your mind, which you can imagine is probably true. You know, you're some young kid in one of these neighborhoods, you're going to start carrying an automatic weapon, you know we're going to stop you. So that's proof of its success, the fact that we get next to nothing. Because it means the word is out, right? The streets are hot. That you got to be crazy if you carry stuff. So people don't carry. So you could use those same statistics. Everyone agrees those are statistics. Stop 700,000. You only arrest to get a contraband, you know, in a very small percentage of time. You can either take that and say, well, that's why it works. That's why it's successful, because it deters people. Or you can say, that's ridiculous. You know, you have reasonable suspicion to stop, but nothing happens after the stop 98% of the time. So how reasonable could your suspicion have been? And this is going to be, this whole stop and frisk thing, which is a very big deal now. There's a mayoral race going on. There's going to be a new mayor in a year, presumably be a new police commissioner. This is something that probably will have to change in New York City. Because whatever you think of stop and frisk, whatever side of that debate you're on, the thing that is true that we know is it's generated so much anger, so much resentment, so much blowback that it's just unsustainable. Even if you think it's a great tactic at the current level the NYPD does it causes too much anger, and the cops are going to have to do something anyhow. But anyhow, that's the kind of thing we'll be asked, you know, come in and take a look at some of this, because people are yelling and screaming, but there's really not a lot of real research about what works, how effective is it, how effective isn't, and that's, you know, that's what we like to do. That's what we do, and that's what we're, you know, it's a self-interested statement. So take it for what it's worth. That's what we're pretty good at doing. That it? All right, it's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, that's it. I'm done. Thanks.